Long before we ever spawned into this world, a far greater civilization ruled the Overworld, the ancient builders. Their greed led them to the Nether, sparking a horrifying, multi-dimensional conflict that ended in their absolute extinction. This is the complete, uninterrupted history of the Nether War. The ancient builders didn't just discover the Nether, they invaded it. Desperate for infinite fuel and gold, they tore holes in reality, building massive obsidian portals to conquer the dimension of fire. But the Nether is alive, and it fought back. The dimension actively rejected their portals, corrupting the frames and causing the very obsidian to weep, glowing purple tears as the two worlds collided. To secure their new conquest against a hostile dimension, the builders needed permanent strongholds. They baked the burning mud into indestructible fortresses and forged artificial floating guardians to defend them. To establish a foothold in this hostile world, the builders baked the very mud of the Nether into indestructible brick fortresses. But the dimension was swarming with threats, and they needed an army to defend their new empire. Just as they built snow golems in the cold, they turned to dark engineering in the heat. They trapped furious souls inside cages of spinning brass rods, creating the blazes, mindless, floating turrets programmed to burn anything that threatened the fire forges. But the intense heat of the fortresses wasn't the only horror waiting for them. The deeper they dug into the Nether, the more they realized it wasn't just a physical dimension. It was a spiritual prison. The ancient builders came to the Nether to conquer, but they didn't realize its most terrifying rule. In this dimension, when you die, you don't get to leave. The souls of the fallen soldiers sank into the dirt, their screaming faces permanently trapped, creating the desolate soul sand valleys. Over generations, the immense grief and agony of thousands of trapped souls merged in the ash-filled air, forming the massive weeping ghasts. As the war dragged on and their overworld portals were destroyed, the trapped builders were forced to adapt to survive. But the toxic environment was already changing them. Not all of the ancient builders died in the open wastes of the Nether. Some barricaded themselves inside massive blackstone bastions, but cut off from the overworld, they were forced to eat the crimson fungus to survive. Over centuries, the toxic environment mutated their DNA. Their minds withered away, leaving only their overwhelming primal greed for gold. The builders devolved into the feral Piglins. They became so biologically infected by the dimension that if they ever try to return to their true home in the overworld, their bodies instantly reject the clean air and they rot alive. Watching their people mutate into feral beasts, the remaining human builders realized they were losing the war. They needed a miracle. Instead, they built a monster. The ancient builders were losing the Nether War. Trapped in their fortresses and mutating into piglins, they needed a miracle. Instead, they built a monster. In a desperate final stand, they experimented with the trapped spirits of the soul sand valleys and the charred bones of their fallen enemies. By fusing cursed soul soil with 3 withered skulls, they created an ultimate superweapon designed to wipe out the Nether's hostile life. But the Wither didn't just hate the Nether, it hated all living things. The weapon immediately turned on its creators, obliterating the fortresses and forcing the few survivors to flee back through the portals. The Wither was supposed to save them, but it only accelerated their doom. The few who survived its wrath fled back through the last remaining portals, but they didn't return home alone. The surviving builders narrowly escaped the Wither, fleeing back through their obsidian portals and shattering them from the overworld side. They thought they were finally safe, but they had unwittingly dragged a microscopic horror back with them from the Nether wastes. A mysterious, incurable sickness swept through their massive cities. And terrifyingly, the dead refused to stay in their graves. The greatest civilization the overworld had ever seen was completely overrun by their own rotting corpses, creating the very first zombie apocalypse. The ancient builders conquered dimensions and played God, but in the end, their own arrogance was their undoing. The rotting zombies we fight today are all that remain of the greatest civilization to ever exist. Subscribe for more deep dives into Minecraft's darkest lore.